Well, good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Interrupting Racism. I'm your host, Brian Prowitz, motivated to share information and conversations that I've been having in Roseburg, Oregon, but also other places around the country as we explore ways to interrupt racism with the goal of basically finding some way to inflict some change and make things better for people of color in our communities. But I am by absolutely no means any kind of an expert on this. I'm just a guy who's learning and asking a lot of questions and talking to all my friends of color about what it's like to be a person of color in our communities right now. And the conversations I'm having and the things that I'm discovering, I think are worth sharing. And that's the point of this podcast. And so we're glad that you're here. You can certainly add your comments and questions on Facebook or on YouTube at Interrupting Racism. And we would welcome those, and we might even run through those as we go through our program today. The person I want to introduce you to today is a friend of mine. He's been a friend of mine for quite some time, and he's an attorney here in Roseburg. His name is Robert Johnson, and Robert is well known in our community and respected by many. He is somebody I've learned an awful lot from over the recent years, but also over the years, I guess. But we've been having more serious conversations here lately, Robert, and I'm just really glad to share some of your insight and your thoughts with more people rather than hogging our conversations so that I am the only one that benefits. So thank you for your time today, and I appreciate you very much.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for inviting me to the show.
Yeah, you bet. Well, the different dynamic essentially that we have today is that we're going to be two guys in Roseburg, Oregon, talking about these issues. Before I talked to Al Jubitz in Portland and talked to Al Terrell in Missouri a week ago in the previous episodes. Those conversations can be a little more general. Certainly we've been talking about the big issues, but now we're bringing this into a smaller fishbowl, if you will, even if you talk about just things in the state of Oregon and in your experience. But if we start to zoom this in a little bit tighter on our community here in Roseburg, it changes a little bit of the dynamics here. And what I mean by that is that we live in a pretty small community, and you and I run into people on the street all the time. And I think that the way we present this information needs to be from the point of view, and I know you agree with me, of love and concern and patience, and maybe sometimes hearing things that you might want to correct out of somebody, but also hoping that there could just be a conversation, I think, is the beginning of this. So do you agree with all that? You want to throw something in there?
Yeah, look, I think the thing to remember about the topic of racism or any topic for that matter that has a spectrum of thoughts and beliefs behind it deserves compassion. I think that is the word to rest on. Certainly, we want to have people who are compassionate for people like George Floyd, the families, Breonna Taylor, people who have suffered loss at the expense of racism. But we also have to understand that we've got to be compassionate about those people who do not understand what it's like to be a Black man or woman, or anybody who suffers systematic oppression or oppression otherwise. And so I think really what I hope to convey here is let's start with compassion and then use that as a vehicle to achieve the goal we set out for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes it's having to admit that there might not be consensus that racism even exists in a place like Roseburg. And I think you and I would agree that we see it. And I am willing to say, actually, not only do I see it, but I think I may be part of the problem. Like, I'd like to figure out ways that I am part of the problem. And so for me, it's a little bit easier because I've already kind of made that jump into realizing that this is a big issue that I may play a part in. So it's even like
Sure.
from that point of view of like having compassion for the conversation, it's baby steps, I think, for
Sure.
some. Yeah.
I think that's right. I think that what you have, the dynamic in a place like Roseburg, and probably lots of rural places in America, is you have a homogenous population who isn't force fed the fact that racism or bigotry or some other systematic problem exists, because they don't have to walk down the street and see the inequalities that present themselves to Black and brown people in this country. And so I think that it then becomes easy to go home on Friday night, have a beer, and turn the TV off when it's not happening in your backyard. You go out on Saturday and you have a barbecue, and you can act as if or believe that these problems aren't real because they're not happening to you. It's just like me as a man. Sometimes I forget that, that women in this country have deficits that we have to account for, because I don't experience it every day. And that doesn't excuse the fact that that it's not on the forefront of my mind, but it becomes easy to not recognize it unless you experience it on a daily basis.
Yeah. And then that's where conversations with people of color, I think, are so valuable. It's like, and you don't want to be the thing that I think I probably have made the mistake of since George Floyd, and I kind of started taking a public approach to this is you shouldn't have to be the teacher to me. I shouldn't have to bounce every concept off of you. You shouldn't have to explain this over and over again to people, but I know you want to, like you're willing to, right?
Oh, yeah.
On some level, I'm sure at some point it probably gets kind of tiring, but I treasure and value the people that want to have that conversation. If I come to them and go, hey, listen, I want to ask you a few more questions. I need to understand this a little bit more. And I appreciate how open you've always been to me on that front.
Anytime, anybody who wants to discuss this, we can get the true, authentic version of where I'm coming from. All you got to do is reach out. But what you said was important. I think that I think you mentioned something about responsibility, and I over the weekend I sent you a link to a brilliant sort of monologue by Will Smith on social media, where he discusses the difference between fault and responsibility. And what I thought it was so important about that is he explains pretty articulately that fault and responsibility don't go hand in hand. In fact, something can not be your fault, but it may be your responsibility to fix. And I think that concept is or should be so ingrained in this conversation about racism. So often I have white friends and even family members who say, I wasn't around when slavery existed, or I didn't enforce Jim Crow era laws, and I understand that. And I think that what the message could be is perhaps those things were not your fault, okay? But if we're going to cure this, if we're going to truthfully analyze what racism is and how it affects people of color, then some people who are unwilling to are going to have to take a responsibility to tackle this conversation and bring about real effectual change.
Yeah. So I think that looks kind of like this. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that my pioneer ancestors didn't have slaves as they came over from Germany and settled in, Nebraska. And I'm Pretty sure that my ancestors didn't break any treaties against the Native Americans. Pretty sure I've never actually been racist overtly toward persons of color in any way.
Yeah.
And all that might be true, but I don't think it should change our desire today to try and break some of these systemic issues that we have the power to change. Hiring practices, how we teach our children, how people talk about people of color from other places who come here, including had a really fascinating conversation with a family from East India this week.
Okay.
And we have an influx of doctors from India and families from India, and they face racism from people on all kinds of ways. So what I like is if people are able to say, instead of saying I've never had a slave and my ancestors didn't have slaves, so this isn't my problem, to be able to say I didn't have slaves, my ancestors don't have slaves, I still might be part of the problem. How can I fix it?
Exactly. The first step, I think, is accepting that there is a problem. The second part is, okay, even if I'm not the problem, what can I contribute to the answer?
Okay, a couple of things I just absolutely have to talk to you about. First of all, can you give us a 60-second biography? Tell us your story, and I'll give you 65 seconds. But you
65,
don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a stopwatch, but just a short
Right.
snapshot of your story.
Abbreviated version. I was hoping you'd give me 65 seconds. Well, I was born and raised in Northeast Portland, which during the 1980s and 1990s was demographically a lot different than what you see today. Most houses, I think, in the neighborhood I grew up in now are going for $500,000. Far cry from what I grew up in. I grew up in a neighborhood and went to a school and went home to a family that experienced violence, experienced disproportionate drug use and abuse, and just in a lot of ways, the circumstances that I grew up in were chaotic. And my parents passed away when I was 20 years old in 2004. I was homeless for a period of time after their death. And the only real escape that I had from the life that I was living at the time was I played ball out in the streets in Portland. One day I got approached by a man who I did not know, who asked me if I'd ever considered playing basketball in college. I kind of blew him off, didn't really think that there was any merit to what he was talking about. I could barely read at the time. And he got in touch with a mentor of mine who encouraged me to take the opportunity to go to Roseburg and visit. When I got here, Donnell Morgan offered me a scholarship to play basketball. And ever since then, my life has been on a trajectory that I would not have predicted prior to it coming to realization.
A couple of things. First of all, what kind of grades did you have? And the second thing is, what was your perception of Roseburg as you considered coming up to Quad Community College?
What kind of grades did I have?
Yeah, and at the time when you were spotted on that playground.
Well, I had somehow graduated from high school, and my high school cumulative GPA was 1.7. And then I came here pretty much without the ability to read and write, but capitalized on some other skills that I had and ended up getting, I think I graduated from UCC with a 3.9 GPA, got a Ford Family Foundation scholarship, graduated from Portland State University, and then went to law school at the University of Oregon. and now I'm a shareholder at the oldest law firm in Douglas County.
Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you.
So, do you consider yourself the exception to the rule? Like, how were you able to pull all of that together so quickly?
Brian, that's a very interesting question that I am, I don't consider myself the necessary exception to the rule. In fact, this question has been posed to me many a times. And going through my journey, I really didn't have an answer for you. I think that, and I'm working on some ways to fashion a message that I think is the blueprint for overcoming circumstances for people who face adversity. And we could have a whole another podcast about that. But I think that there are people where I'm from. I know there are lots of people who are from where I'm from who would thrive if given a real legitimate shot. I guess when you say the exception to the rule, it was probably a divine intervention for that man to approach me on the basketball court and give me an opportunity that so many of the brothers and sisters where I'm from don't get. But despite the fact they don't have the opportunity, they have everything, every tool that they need to go and do the things that I've accomplished. That's the real tragedy.
I don't want to gloss over that.
Yeah.
And actually, now that I think about it, saying the exception to the rule almost has a racist connotation to it.
Yeah, I understand what you're asking.
But I feel like I just stereotyped, black people from, I don't know. Anyway, I just got this big slap of sort of like a conviction of phrases like that. You ask an innocent question like that, and it could be conveyed that way.
Okay. Your question in and of itself is a product of the problem. Okay. Am I an exception to the rule? That's because I am an exception to the rule from the standpoint of the opportunity doesn't present itself where I'm from. That is a myth to believe that anybody from the inner city ghettos or hoods in America, in Black communities, it is a complete myth to believe that opportunity is just prevalent there. It just isn't. I just said that it took happenstance for my story to come together. If the guy, one, doesn't go to the park that day, or if the guy, two, isn't inspired enough to come talk to me, who knows where my life would be now.
Right. So I've had some really amazing conversations in this past week since my interview with Al Terrell. One of them was from a friend of mine who doesn't live in this area anymore, who is a person of color. And he says, you know what? This starts at home. Racism is in the eye of the beholder. This conversation, it's good to keep talking about it, but man, too many people use racism as an excuse.
Sure.
And it shocked me. It really surprised me. I couldn't believe it. And it kind of falls into that category of like that whole Morgan Freeman take on all of this, that we should just, we don't need to be talking about this. This is a class issue. There's all kinds of different ways to look at it. What's your take on that whole conversation, either the Morgan Freeman card or the conversation I had with my friend?
Sure. Let's put it this way. One thing that we can argue are that there are disparities when it comes to people of color, particularly Black males. Okay. I think there's something like 2.1 million inmates in federal penitentiaries in this country. And 44% of those, or somewhere in that ballpark, are Black. And so there's a disparity there. Okay. And so you think, well, what contributes to that? And some people point to the decision making of people who grew up like me. Okay. And then I think about, well, why do those people make those decisions? And is it just for convenience? Is it just for a fast life? What's the problem here? And in thinking about that, I think about these lyrics that were one of my heroes is Jay-Z. He's a famous rapper. A lot of people know him. And one of the things he said in one of his songs is profound on this topic. He says, whoever said that illegal was the easy way out could not understand the mechanics and the workings of the underworld. Okay. So in other words, it's easy to sit back and assume that people of color or people, or even if you remove color, people who are not doing well, are lazy or have their priorities misaligned or are just out of touch with the concept of hard work. But the truth is that unless you're engaging in some of those activities, you don't really know how hard it is to be a single mother who accepts assistance from the government, or you don't know what a drug dealer has to worry about on the streets day in and day out. And these are people who I know, and I would tell you with utter confidence that the vast majority of those people who are engaging in the acts that we as a society disapprove of would rather trade in that life for one of what we call legitimacy. And so I think there's some flawed assumptions that go into some of the things that people are saying about whether or not these problems exist.
I want to, I might have you come back to that a little bit more too. I probably need to delve into that. And maybe that's a
Sure.
conversation we can have again a little bit later on. There's a couple things I want to make sure that I get through. You wrote an amazing piece on Facebook here not too long ago to your son, Marcus, brand new baby. How old is he now?
He was born on June 3rd. So he's almost 8 weeks.
Almost 8 weeks old. And you wrote this piece to him as your son, and it opened my eyes. It really was powerful. But you also wrote something to your daughter as well. And how old is she? It's Natalie, right?
Natalie, my sweet little girl, will turn 3 years old on this Saturday.
Oh my!
Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. Well, you're going to have busy summers from now on for sure. The rest of your life with birthdays. So tell me about those notes, those letters that you wrote to your children.
Well, the first one, obviously, that I wrote was to Natalie. I think I was looking at a picture of hers, and I was just inspired to leave some words for her to consider in the event that that she comes of age at a time when I'm not available to her. And the reason I say that is because I was 20 years old in 2004. And in 2004, in April of 2004, my father died. In July of 2004, my mother died. And my life was spinning out of control. Really didn't know. I didn't know anything about life, okay, except for how to survive. And what has been the most challenging thing for me since their deaths, particularly the death of my mother, is that navigating the world and trying to figure out how to be a man, how to survive and thrive with little or no direction, particularly trustworthy direction. I have a lot of people, and I don't want for any period of time go and perpetuate some type of story that I did this alone. I have a vast network of people who have always been there to support me, but nothing like my mother. And so I wanted to memorialize some thoughts for my daughter. And I wanted to tell her, what I thought was important for her as a young lady to know. And particularly, I made some promises to her in that note. And the promises and the overall tone of the message were, if I'm not here, I want you to know that your dad loved you and your dad is there for you, and that these are some important things that I think you need to consider wherever I am. Because I wanted her to always understand that she had value, and that whether or not I'm here in the flesh or not, that at the very least, she could always know with 100% certainty that her dad loved her. And so I shared that on Facebook. Fast forward a year and a half later, George Floyd is murdered in Minneapolis, and I'm getting ready to have a son. And I had these emotions going through I'm experiencing these emotions of anxiety, guilt, shame, frustration, fear, sadness. And so I wanted to tell my son that the emotions that I was feeling at that time are going to be inevitable for him, because he's going to be a Black man, and in America particularly. And here's the concern I had, that again, whether or not I'm here, because I won't always be there. I'm always going to be there for him, but I won't always be there when he's faced with a situation that's going to be difficult to navigate. But I wanted him to know that there are certain things that he has to consider about the fact that he is Black, before walking out of our house every night. One of the things that I highlighted was a talk that my mom had with me, that most young Black boys especially have with their parents. And it's usually referred to as the talk, about how you deal with police officers when you encounter them. And what was important for me to tell Marcus is that cops, for the most part, are good guys. No, I work with the police on a daily basis through my job. And as much as they want to go out and serve and protect, they also want to go home to their families at night. And for Marcus, the talk is about, here's some basic instructions for how you as a Black man need to consider when dealing with the police. Don't answer any questions. Tell them you want to speak to your dad, because your dad's an attorney. You have a right to an attorney. But most of all, don't confirm some of the flawed assumptions that anybody might have about a Black man that would cause them to reasonably respond out of fear. Don't be a tough guy. Be respectful. Yes, officer, no officer. And then get me on the phone and I'll take care of it.
Both of those are they're a mixture of all the stuff that dads feel, no matter what their background is or anything, as I think about what you said to Natalie.
Well, I'll tell you this. Let me share this part too. In the note to Marcus, I talked about these heart-stopping milestones that are inevitable to happen. Okay, he's gonna get behind the wheel one day. He's gonna date a girl someday. He's I mean, he's gonna dress a certain way. He's gonna need to express his emotions. Those things are delicate when you're a black man. You have to be aware that they have the potential for being misinterpreted. And so at the end of the day, you got to take some extra steps and extra precautions to protect yourself and your family and those you love, because you do have some negative stereotypes attached to you that are involuntary.
Yeah. And I ask myself, and people have asked me, how long do we have to have this conversation? How long will that concern exist? And I think we should be having these conversations until you don't have to have that conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's the key is let's talk about it. I mean, the point is, let's talk about it, because there are certain truths for me that you're never going to understand, and there are certain truths for you that I'm never going to understand. And I think that the goal of the majority of Americans is probably that I wish that this weren't a problem. I wish that this weren't a problem. From whatever background you come from, I think that a close is pretty close to consensus is that I wish this wasn't a problem that we had to deal with, but it is. And the reason why I think it continues to be a problem is because we don't want to have a respectable conversation with each other.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is sad in itself, and which is another reason for my desire to have these conversations like this and share them with people. So, yeah, setting the bar at the level of, to me, it comes to fear. Fear is such an important driving motivation for me on this. When I hear, and I've said it before, when I hear my friends in Portland, women of color, who say they never stop in Roseburg. Yeah, they've been taught never to stop in Roseburg their entire lives.
Yeah.
Your perception of Roseburg when you were up in Portland, and the question came up if you want to come play basketball at Umpqua Community College. The conversations you've had with your children on this front. How do we fix those things? How do we make them go away? And I don't know that we ever will. I'm not sure how you can eradicate racism.
Yeah.
So I need help on that. If you have an idea.
No, I don't know. I don't know if you can either. I think that the closest we can come is what we've been talking about, having this conversation, which is why I think that a podcast like Interrupt Racism is so important, because at the very least, it's the exchange of ideas and thoughts on the topic. Okay. This podcast might reach somebody who never considered something before. And hopefully if me and your other guests, yourself, or being authentic, we're conveying ideas that maybe somebody would consider as maybe having some truth to it. But the problem is that we all live with our own ignorances. Okay. And it's not just here in Roseburg, the places I grew up. Listen, Brian, I had no idea what rural America was like. Okay. Absolutely zero idea what the values were, of what the politics were, of what, the day-to-day grind in rural America was. When I grew up, see, 1992, Bill Clinton was elected. I was 8 years old. From that time until George Bush was elected, I just thought everybody voted Democrat. And so certainly, it took until I got to Roseburg for me to understand that, okay, well, hey, here's a different way of looking at things. Here's how people process things differently, and more importantly, here's why. Okay, and so let politics and belief systems aside, I think what I've encountered in Roseburg generally is acceptance, even from those people who may be ignorant about some of the things that I've gone through, and I don't mean the term ignorant in any vile way. I think what we're talking about is people who are not informed about certain things, about maybe how I grew up. Okay. And when you come here to Roseburg and you experience Roseburg, you will know why somebody may not look at the same issue the same way somebody where I'm from looks at it.
Yeah. Now, I've heard from quite a few of my friends who remind me, and I'm reminded of this a lot too. I love this town. I love this place because it's 20 years behind the times. Actually, it's one of the reasons why I like it a lot. And it's not always a good thing to be 20 years behind the times, believe me. But I do like that, some elements of that. But we have a giving, caring, amazing community. We have been through horrible things together like UCC and seen incredible love from strangers and from our own neighbors here in town. I mean, and I think for the most part, I think we have people who care. I think we have elected officials who are accountable. I think we have policing that's accountable. I think there's something special about this place. And that's why it hurts me so much when I hear people say, people of color who I've talked to in this town, and ask them what it's like to live here. And I hear the stories that I hear. It just breaks my heart. And some of it's overt, some of it's covert. There's a big difference. And I think I've come to the conclusion also that I think if you walked up to the most racist person you could possibly find and asked them if they are racist, they'd say they are not. They'd have some other philosophy or mentality that would explain why they do, but they wouldn't admit that they are racist, which is why I think it's really great when every once in a while we need to stop and ask ourselves, but am I? Like accidentally? Or maybe are there things I could learn that would keep me from falling into that category? And I'm hoping that people who watch this who aren't from Roseburg don't come away confirming that in their minds that the perception they may have of our area is true. And that I just think it's everywhere. Because I've also talked to people of color who say, okay, if I feel like it's like this way here, where can I go?
Sure.
And you almost can't go anywhere else. And so, because there isn't a place where they're like, stamp, this place is not racist. Find that place. So I think every place has some work to do. And I think we all have work to do. And I would love it if more people would say, I might be part of the problem. How can I help?
Well, let me add to it by saying this, Brian. One, I've been called the N-word on Harvard Avenue out here in Roseburg. I've also been called the N-word in New York City, a place where you would probably suspect that it's least likely to happen than anywhere else in the United States. And so, I agree with you that, hey, look, this isn't a place where we can just go ahead and take a survey and determine that it is or isn't racist. Okay. That's not how this works. Okay. But I think more importantly is what I'm concerned about is this is kind of a delicate thing, how to articulate it, but labels are problematic. Okay. Sure. We understand that there are racist people in the United States and worldwide. Absolutely. 100%. Unequivocally, no question about it. We know that racists exist. We know that there are people with hatred in their heart toward people who look differently than they do, particularly towards Black people. Okay. Um, but labeling people, I think, often runs the risk of turning them off to the conversation, turning them off to being a part of the solution. So I think what the real uh, analysis needs to be, whether or not I think I'm a racist. This is an internal dialogue you have with yourself, or internal monologue, I guess, or dialogue. Whether or not I think I'm a racist, am I contributing to racism either indirectly or directly? And when it lands there, at least I'm willing to go ahead and analyze, well, okay, I don't think I'm a racist. However, what are the things I'm doing on a daily basis, and how can those things be contributing, whether or not I mean to? That's the analysis I think that's going to start to break down some of these concerns about whether or not people are acting out of malice. I'll go back to Jay-Z, who in an interview said there was a real misstep in the NBA a few years ago. You may remember this, that Donald Sterling got ousted for saying some racist remarks about Magic Johnson and some other people. Donald Sterling, the owner of the Clippers. And Jay-Z said that I think that was a misstep because, there are people who think like this. There are people who think like this. And then when you oust a guy like Donald Sterling for having these beliefs or thoughts, you send everybody back into a hole. They don't want to be confronted with the fact that they're racist or be accused of being racist. So instead, maybe what should have happened, yeah, you deal with him, he loses a draft pick or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, but encourage him to be a part of the conversation. Encourage him to be the solution to racism, either directly or indirectly.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's where I want to try to figure out a place where you can have a conversation where there's that's where you get into the comments around comfort, what makes you comfortable and whatnot. And
Okay.
You and I have had a conversation. I'm wearing this shirt. You and I called you up because I wanted to check with you on this concept of producing T-shirts and donating the proceeds to the Black United Fund of Portland. And I called Jeff and I said, hey, we got this idea for shirts, and the one shirt's going to say "Speak Up with Us," and it's going to say "Speak Up." And we discussed slogans, and some of the slogans need to have a little more bite to them sometimes in order to sort of have an impact.
Sure.
And then there's this level of, okay, we want to try to draw people into a conversation. And so you got to find kind of that balance on how that can even happen. And the shirts is the first example that I could think of that we kicked around. What I find is there are people that are willing to have those conversations, and I'm just hoping that we can reach some of them through efforts like this. It'd be great if people shared these conversations with others as well. Do you find yourself with the opportunity to have conversations like this very often?
Oh, very often. Unfortunately, it's usually with people who believe things that I believe too. They already are. I would prefer to have the conversation with people who think differently than me. Mm-hmm. Here's the thing: I do have those conversations with those people, and usually, more times than not, that when I have conversations with people who, at the outset, disagree with me, we usually become friends. Because I think that, like I said earlier, the goal for most people is to get rid of this problem. We just disagree on the extent to which it exists and the extent to which energy needs to be put behind a solution. And so And here's the other part, about the discussion about comfort. Well, I don't know. I could be wrong, but I can't imagine that it is uncomfortable for anybody to speak out against racism. You see where I'm coming from? I can't imagine that that is an uncomfortable topic for anybody to have. So the reluctance for anybody to say Black Lives Matter is just, I mean, it's beyond me, because you have a situation where really the intent behind that movement is to say, hey, we want racism to stop. Okay. But it takes a different level of thought and calculation when you have somebody who you think or suspect might be harboring some ill will toward a person of color, to label them as a racist, because once you do that, I think the prospects of reaching them and helping dispel some of the ignorance that they have become very minuscule.
Yeah. Yeah, and the opportunity to actually reach people like that is very limited in my experience, because
Right.
you have to stop for a minute and then admit and be vulnerable and admit that you might be wrong. And right now, that's not a very
Right.
popular thing to do. Just a few more thoughts here. So. What work are you doing, or what do you want to try to accomplish here in town to try and continue this conversation? Because you and I, in a side conversation, we were talking about noticing that the debate around masks is brewing and continuing right now, but there isn't a whole lot of conversation in Roseburg or in Douglas County on the racism front. It's like it kind of came and went. I'm happy that we're having this conversation right now, because I think now keeping the conversation going is valuable. How do we do that? And and you could ask me the same question, but what are you wanting to do, or how are you trying to keep that conversation going?
Sure. Well, the point is to continue to have the conversation, like you're saying, and I think the way to do that successfully is to create a forum for which we can exchange ideas and thoughts in a way that they are protected, that people don't have to feel as if they're being villainized for how they perceive the world, in order to inspire education and dispel ignorance for people on both sides of the aisle. You and I had previously talked about a number of different ways to do that. Maybe a listening session was the first idea, where public leaders such as yourself would invite the public in to discuss ideas, or you, excuse me, you just listen. You just sit there and listen to the public's concerns about any particular topic. For us, it happened to be the topic of race in America and race in Roseburg, Douglas County. Another thought was we host a town hall, and some of these things have been complicated by the public health crisis that we're going through right now. But the other idea was holding a town hall and having some of the more prominent voices, the people who have the ability to affect influence in our area, to have a town hall that's moderated and might give the opportunity for you all, whoever would be on the panel, to answer questions about the perception of race and the policy behind race and the practicality of race in Roseburg and Douglas County.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd need to be on the panel, but I'd certainly want to talk to people and express more of what it's like to be a person of color in our community for sure.
Sure.
And if I was on a panel like that, it'd probably be talking about the experience that I've had with putting myself in a position of vulnerability within a group of people who are from a completely different background than I am. And we all kind of lay our stuff out on the table and start talking about why we believe what we believe in the opportunity to potentially learn from other people. But boy, it is so rare to do that. I wish I could find a way for everybody who wants to have an experience like that, where they can learn from other people and literally confront racism in a way that, on the streets of Roseburg, if you have the conversation and it gets a little uncomfortable, when I turn around, I get to walk back into all my white friends, and we don't have to have the conversation. And at the end of the night, when I turn off the light, I'm still a white guy, and no matter how much we work on this issue or want to debate whether it exists, which seems silly, at the end of the day, your children, you turn off the light, and no matter what gains you've made in a day, you are still going to sleep. An African-American man with serious challenges that you have to face, and I get to forget about it when I turn off the light. And I think that hits me a lot. I recognize that all the time. And
let me say, Brian, let me say this. I think this is important to know. Okay. Racism, I think, in 2020 looks a lot different than it did in 1920 or even 1965. Okay. And even 1980. And what I want the people who are watching this to understand about the experience of Black people in this country is that on an individual level, I'm not overly concerned about going to the store at night and worried about maybe a mob of angry white men chasing me down with pitchforks or whatever. That's not to say it doesn't cross my mind, okay? But the overt racism is not the only thing that is problematic for Black people on this topic of racism. I'm scared for a misunderstanding. I'm scared for a false accusation. I'm scared for a reaction inside somebody that's based on something they learned somewhere else, on TV, in music, whatever it may be. I'm worried about the underlying tone of race in America. For the most part, I mean, you see the things like Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and yeah, like I said, those things happen. But for the most part, that's not what keeps me up at night. I'm a big guy. I can handle myself for the most part. But it's some of these things that are invisible to the naked eye that have a profound effect on what we go through as Black people.
Yeah, well, man, I feel like we should have started with that comment and gone from there at the beginning of this podcast. So, and I know you probably touched on it, but what are some of those things?
Well, like I said, I mean, it runs a gamut, and it has a lot to do with what I talked about in my letter to Marcus. It's, you have this situation in Ferguson, Missouri a few years ago, okay? And there's some dispute about how things happened, okay? And I remember having a conversation before any decision was made about whether or not to prosecute the officer involved, and I had this conversation with a judge that I know, and I told the judge, I said, I'm afraid that whatever happens, even if this officer is prosecuted, and by then we didn't have all of the evidence, we didn't know what happened. I think we still probably don't know what happened. But I said, my fear is that if something did take a racist tone, and let's say this officer, killed this young man for whatever reason, okay, and it wasn't justified, I think you can then go ahead and say to a jury, I was in fear for my life, and that some of these implicit biases that we have because we watch TV or we listen to music are going to feed into the notion that this young man, or Trayvon Martin, or Philando Castillo, or Ahmaud Arbery, or Walter Scott, or George Floyd, if these things aren't on video and someone says I was afraid for my life, the fact that these men are Black and there's negative stereotypes that follow them makes it justifiable to escalate the situation in order to preserve your own life. And I'm not suggesting that happened. I don't know what happened. The true tragedy is somebody lost their life. And I think that when you go into a public forum and say, I was afraid of a Black man, or I had this perception of how a Black man would respond or act, then I think that because we have such attachments in terms of stereotypes following us around, I think that disproportionate responses are often justified.
Well, we're just about at the end of our time, and I want to thank you for. First of all, I've learned a ton from you. You've always been extremely gracious to me, and I look forward to more conversations around this. I hope that you keep me accountable on some of the things that I've been talking about, and let's find ways to continue to eradicate these issues as they come up. Interrupting racism. We could have said stop racism. Could have said, erase racism. I don't think it's going to probably ever go away, but we can interrupt it with conversations like this one that hopefully will also get on the radar and in the minds of some of the people out there that just might need to stop and check themselves a little bit and try to learn a little bit more. And I've seen examples. I've seen extreme examples of this. There's a man named Arno Marcalis who's on Facebook, who was a skinhead in Milwaukee for a long time. And he was a bad human being. And he did a lot of damage to a lot of people. And now he operates a huge nonprofit in Milwaukee on togetherness and love in the community. It's incredible. And I know there are moments when people have them and they hopefully they just stop for half a second and they realize this is wrong and they need to figure out a way to make things better. And so on smaller scale, children who have been brought up a certain way and see something and just got to know it's wrong, hopefully can ask some questions and find peace and love toward people who don't look like them, who maybe they've been taught are less than, or that they need to hold down. It'd be great to break through in some of those ways. And so that's my hope. I think that you've added a lot for people to take in and listen to. And I hope that they hear you. I hope that we can learn more. More people can learn more from you through this. And again, your friendship is important to me, and I appreciate you here in our community. You make our community better. You make it more vibrant and beautiful. And congratulations on Marcus and the other successes you've had in your life. And thank you. Before I sign off with this big bow I'm putting together for the end of this year, do you want to say anything else before we sign off?
I'll just say this, short and simple. think we can do this, but we've got to do it together.
Perfect. That was a better bow than the one I was tying. So, yeah, let's do it together. So, thanks again. And I know I'll see you soon. And thank you for everything.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Robert Johnson, an attorney here in Roseburg. Somebody that if you haven't met Robert before, go up and say hi to him next time you get a chance, and let him know that he's welcome and loved in this community, and get to know him a little bit. So take him to lunch, have some coffee, and continue the conversation. All right. Well, thank you very much for being part of Interrupting Racism. If you would like, visit speakuptous.org. That's where we have shirts like this one and others with little slogans on them that you can check out. We would love to crank out a big order of those and send them out here pretty soon. And if you have ordered T-shirts, by the way, we're kind of waiting to build up our first one before we to save some money on the total price that we're paying out, because all the revenue from that we make at the end of the day is going to go to the Black United Fund of Portland, which we have taken a look at and think is highly worthy of our support. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for watching and sharing. And we'll talk to you again next time on Interrupting Racism.